Good evening, everyone. We are on a cold and frosty evening, warming ourselves up with a little teachings, right? So we're plowing through the Tibetan tradition of mental development. Geshe Nawang Darge's one of his first teachings in the West and published in India way back when. And we were in the midst of the first noble truth, the truth of suffering. And I wanted to start with something because this is so detailed and so full. So he's presenting again, like the title, The Tibetan Tradition of Mental Development. So this book is an overview of the Mahayana in the fullness with which it was transmitted to Tibet, because I think, as you're all aware, Buddhism has passed around almost the entire world, and usually kind of serendipitously. For instance, it went to China with monks who were just sort of tacked on to merchant caravans, and so filtered in that way, different lineages, different ways. But Tibet was different in that their emperor, when they were at the height of their military and political power, decided that Buddhism would be a good idea. I'm being facetious here, but nonetheless, it was from the top down, like royal command, and not forcing people to be Buddhists, but the king sent over generations the best and brightest across the Himalayas to India to learn the Sanskrit Indian languages and be empowered and receive the transmissions for the full range of Mahayana as it existed, Buddhism itself as it existed in India, like 1,500 years after the Buddha passed away. So rather remarkable, the completion of it. And then brought that back, developed even the written Tibetan language. And so you find this extreme effort paid off in the carefulness and the correctness of the transmission. Some years ago, for instance, there was a one sutra that they had lost. They had it in the Tibetan. They didn't have in Chinese, but they didn't have it in the original Sanskrit. And lo and behold, someone like in the 1960s or 50s, I'm not sure exactly, found an original Sanskrit copy in the library of some remote Tibetan monastery. And when they, compared it to the Tibetan translation, I mean, it was perfect, syllable by syllable. So rather remarkable. They were so careful, and they had such brilliant people doing this with such serious commitment. So even before the rise of the Mahayana, these fundamental Buddhist teachings that Professor Kanzi calls, I think he calls it original Buddhism. And you had these principles, of no self, no permanence, impermanence, no self, impermanence, and suffering or dissatisfaction. So when we're going through this book with Geshe Nawang Darge, the Tibetans, it's starting out with Buddha's first noble truth of suffering. The original Buddhism is what Professor Kanze called, there was several centuries. The Buddha passed away, and there was this effort to transmit his teachings. Different monks, different monasteries would specialize in different parts of his teaching, but it was like Homer in the Greeks. It was all oral transmission. And that's why so many of the sutras sound kind of, rote or ritualistic, going through all these different factors of, whatever, when they break things down in this logical way, because they preserved it in this way. But nonetheless, they talk about, you have these three basic insights into the nature of the world. That is, there's no self, no permanently abiding, self that's like completely unaffected by causes and conditions. There is impermanence, and there's also dissatisfaction or suffering. And basically, the worldly views that we have are called the viparyasas, they call them, if I'm pronouncing it correctly. It's the term that it means, I think, in Sanskrit, the perversions. And what this means is to pervert. The old English verb to pervert is to turn up something upside down. It was the verb that was used when they talked about a cart turning over upside down. And so we have an upside down view through our senses and through our habitual conceptualizations that is the opposite. In other words, we see what is actually selfless as being containing a self. Whether it's an object like a table or a person, we're dealing all the time with the selfishness, you might say, of reality. But in truth, reality is selfless. And so too, we see things in a permanent way. That chair looks like it's going to be there forever. We don't see that it's actually impermanent from the instant. And certainly we have so much suffering just because we have this assumption that things are not going to change. But of course, everything's changing every instant, although we don't see it at that level. And then finally, we see things that are actually have the nature of dissatisfaction, suffering. We see things as being full of joy or not being a cause of suffering. This fundamental mistake that we make, and of course, through cause and effect, we're always searching for happiness, but we're planting causes that result in suffering. And similarly, it's said that the ordinary person, that's the gross kind of suffering that we're all aware of, that we read about in the newspaper, that we talk to each other about, that we fear, that we whatever. This is gross level of suffering. But the subtle suffering is something that we don't see. It's in the nature of appearances themselves. It's said, for instance, that the subtle suffering, the gross suffering is like if you have, well, we know gross sufferings, we can't escape it. But the subtle suffering is like a hair that is resting on your fingernail. You're not aware of it. But it's said that the bodhisattva, the enlightened bodhisattva, the Arya bodhisattvas, that it's like they feel that hair as if it's stuck in their eye. So suffering is where the Buddha started with his teachings, where the Geshe is starting his book, because it's so important to understand this suffering nature of samsara. And I did look a little bit for Professor Kanzi's book, and just a little bit here to give you an idea. He says the identity, he's talking about now more profound Mahayana teachings, is that the identity of suffering and ill and ease, he calls it, the identity of ill and ease is not disclosed to those who wish to avoid suffering at all costs, but it can be experienced by those greatly compassionate heroes who joyfully welcome suffering if and when it helps other creatures. For to them, quote, suffering endured for the sake of others brings happiness, unquote. Men have made many attempts to drive out the fear of suffering by some kind of spiritual reasoning. They have seen it as part of the beneficial purpose of the absolute. They have found cosmic and karmic reasons for it. They have argued that it adds to the harmony of the whole. They have endowed it with a sacramental meaning which sanctifies our life. They have proved that evil is really nothing, only the good being something, and so on. But to the sufferer, all this is rather cold comfort, and Candide has, on the whole, found more followers than Pangloss. Not content with inducing people to acquiesce in their sufferings, the Mahayana more ambitiously attempts to transcend suffering by identifying it with its opposite. The recipient of this teaching will, of course, feel no better off than before if he is lacking in the high-mindedness expected of him. He's such a curmudgeon. But still, we're with Geshe Naman Dargay, and we were in the noble truth of suffering, and I'm just going to list them here. We read through last time the 8 aspects of suffering, and he said these refer primarily to the kinds of suffering borne by humanity: the suffering of birth, the suffering of old age, the suffering of sickness, and the suffering of death. The suffering of being separated from that which we desire or are attached to. The suffering of meeting with undesirable events. The suffering of not finding the happiness and pleasures of life which we seek. The suffering of having a body. A samsaric body is like having a magnet that collects suffering of many kinds. While undergoing suffering from past karmic actions, it produces further karma, which causes suffering in future lives. By realizing that wherever we exist within the 6 realms of samsara, we must experience suffering, we shall see the need of cutting this karmic tie to the body. It is impossible for us to know the taste of the Dharma without critically examining and meditating upon it. This path is easier if we pray to one whom we trust, asking for an enlightened mind. So those were the, what did he call them, the types of suffering? Look again. 8 aspects of suffering: birth, old age, sickness, death. Separated from what we desire, meeting with undesirable events, not finding the happiness and pleasures of life, the suffering of having a body itself. And then he's listing the 6 forms of suffering. And these are experienced by all beings, not just by humans. First is uncertainty. There's always the possibility. This famous story of Shariputra, one of the Buddha's 2 main disciples, while begging for alms, came to the house of a woman who was holding her child, eating a fish, and kicking her dog. By his clairvoyance, he was able to see that in a past life, the child had been the woman's enemy who had killed her. The fish she was eating had been her mother, and the dog had been her father. She then fed the bones of the fish to the dog. And this furnishes an example of how friends change to enemies and enemies to friends. So again, 6 forms of suffering now. Uncertainty, greed is the second one. And think of this, no matter how much we possess, if we have greed, we can never have satisfaction. And we certainly see this. Worldly pleasures are like drinking salt water, which temporarily soothes our thirst, but then leads to yet greater desire. So, 6 forms of suffering: uncertainty, greed. Next is the necessity of repeatedly abandoning our body. This heap of bones from all our past lives, the heap of bones from all our past lives would be greater than the size of the earth. And this heap will increase indefinitely unless we cultivate renunciation. So, uncertainty, greed, necessity of repeatedly abandoning our body. Fourth is the entering of consciousness into the union of semen and blood at conception. And he says, samsaric existence is without beginning. If one were able to form little balls from all the matter of the earth, this would still not equal the number of the mothers we have had in all our forms of existence. It's such a vast view. And it kind of is hard for us, you know. It's easy in an abstract or conceptual way to talk about, you know, the infinity of space or one thing or another. But the Tibetans are so great at putting this into, well, this is Indian actually, but into such, you know, hard material examples, which just, of course, just totally violate our ordinary acceptance. And why? Because it shows the attachment we have to this material realm, you might say, and seeing everything as having self or being a thing in itself. You know, again, seeing unsatisfaction as being satisfactory, and as seeing impermanent things as being permanent. All right, so uncertainty, greed, repeatedly abandoning our body. the entering of consciousness into the union of seminal and blood at conception. Fifth is the uncertain level of future rebirth. Even though we take high rebirth in one life, if we fail to practice the Dharma, we will always fall back. Even such beings as the chakra kings who rule the continents in certain periods during which there's no war or famine may fall to lower states. So that's the fifth one, the uncertain level of future rebirth. And then sixth is the lack of friends, companionship. Then he continues with the aspects of suffering, the kinds of suffering. No, sorry, what did he say? The six forms of suffering. Now the three kinds of suffering. There's the suffering of misery, sickness, both mental and physical pain, hunger, and thirst are the main examples of this suffering. So the suffering of misery. Second is the suffering of change. This is due to the impermanence of all things in samsara. For example, if we move from the shade to the sunshine, we enjoy the warmth at first. But then when we become too hot, we again seek the shade. All samsaric pleasure has this aspect of impermanence, the nature of which is suffering or dissatisfaction that causes us to continually seek new sources of happiness. So we get the suffering of misery, the suffering of change, and now the suffering of extensiveness. This suffering is experienced not only in this life, but on all levels of samsaric existence. As soon as we take on a body, it acts like a magnet, attracting suffering. Denizens of the hells must endure the suffering of heat and cold. Pretas suffer from hunger and thirst. Animals suffer from ignorance and stupidity. In the higher realms, humans suffer from birth, old age, sickness, and death. The anti-gods, the Asuras, suffer from jealousy and continual disappointment. And Devas suffer during the last 7 days of their lives when they become aware that they are about to die. Possessing a samsaric body, we resemble a naked person carrying a bundle of thorns bound to their back by the rope of karma and kleshas. Thus, we must develop true renunciation of this third kind of suffering of extensiveness, seeking total release from all forms of samsaric existence. It is important to recognize suffering in the world, especially when it is occurring. The root of all suffering is our belief in the concept of our own fixed, independent self. And realization of shunyata is like the knife that cuts the root of ignorance. Belief in true, independent self-existence is like seeing a rope and mistaking it for a snake. Realization of shunyata is like recognizing the rope for what it actually is. With respect to a person, conventional truth is the 5 skandhas, or aggregates, which we falsely grasp as having self-existence, and ultimate truth is the void nature of all phenomena. It is our false concept of self-existence that causes the collection of karma. When the former, our false concept, is rectified, the latter, the collection of karma, disappears. So there we have it. First Noble Truth, it really presents the entire path. Well, it seemed to me, more and more, it's like the Dharma is this beautiful image in the Avatamsaka Sutra of Indra's net. And it's this huge, long sutra, many, many different chapters and parts to it and stories and everything. But there's this one example, it's called Indra's net. And it's this threads hanging, from the space down to the earth, and individual jewels strung on each one of those threads. So like an infinite number of jewels hanging on these ropes, these threads. And every one of them is reflected in every one of them. So it's this amazing interdependence and immediacy. We think of enlightenment as something that's like our Buddha nature, like a jewel that's covered over and we're uncovering it. Yes, that's true. And for us, whatever seems real, is real, and that's where we're working from. But at the same time, there's this instantaneousness. Nothing is hidden. This interpenetration is just mind-boggling and free. And so every single part of the Dharma, you can say, contains, like one of those jewels, contains the whole Dharma, because there's just one taste, one truth, although it's expressed in so many different ways in this attempt to lead people to happiness, then to liberation, and then further to enlightenment for the liberation of all. Yet it's all there in each one. So here we have his first initial introduction, the first noble truth, and he gets right down to the core of it. All right, so that's the first noble truth. Now, the second one is the cause of suffering, and we'll launch into that tonight. He's talking about aspects of the arising of suffering: the cause of suffering, the source of suffering, the circumstances of suffering, and the violent development of growth of suffering. All right, so basically, two causes of suffering are karma and kleshas. Karma means the secondary consciousness belonging to the stream of consciousness, and is automatically moves the latter like a magnet attracting a piece of metal. So again, karma is the secondary consciousness belonging to the primary stream of consciousness, and karma automatically moves consciousness like a magnet attracting a piece of metal. I mean, think of it. When, I don't know, someone insults you, or someone disagrees with you, or someone whatever, and the anger arises. It's so instantaneous. We don't see the process of it coming. It's just suddenly there. And that's the consciousness that we're aware of. So we think that's it. We think that's absolute. We think that's real. We think that's the whole story. And therefore, we're totally justified, if we think about it, of acting out of that, thinking out of that, talking out of that. Because to us, it's like total. The power of ignorance, and it's important to understand that ignorance is not stupidity. It's just simply ignoring. It's just simply not seeing. I think it was, we had this 4-day weekend because of the Thanksgiving holiday in the States. Thanksgiving's on a Thursday. So basically, Friday is not a work day, and then the usual Saturday and Sunday. And I get a little bit thrown off, I think, with my old brain and also just the schedule. And it was Saturday. And Gretchen and I go out, eat Saturday morning, just have a cup of coffee together at a particular place. And, it's kind of a routine. But for some reason, I was convinced it was Sunday. And she was saying, hey, we got to go. It's like 9 o'clock. And I'm thinking, well, Dharma Center's at 10. What is she in such a hurry about? And so, I got a little bit shamed to go upstairs and get dressed and everything. And I came down, and I was wearing this Tibetan shirt that I wear to the Dharma Center. And she said, what are you doing? And I said, well, I'm getting ready to go. She says, it's Saturday. But my point is the power of ignorance. I was moving at 100% confidence. there was no question about it. I didn't question it. I didn't look. And that's what we do. And yet what comes out of that, in this case, of course, pretty minor, but it's an example of just how powerful ignorance is. But in this totally kind of secret kind of way, we don't see the process of its working, because we're working out with what we see, but there's this depth that we don't see. Yeah, a magnet attracting a piece of metal, just bang, like that. The primary mind thus collects the black and white karma of the secondary mind. And so this is the kind of tragedy of life, is that we're living with these karmas, these black and white. One teacher once said that really the Dharma, if you really boil it down, is emptiness and cause and effect. Cause and effect is how emptiness appears to our dualistic mind. So the whole process of all those things happening in the emptiness, they're all the same, so to speak. There's no self. That process isn't there. But this is why the two wings, wisdom, emptiness, and compassion, skillful means, cause and effect, knowledge of cause and effect, acting out of cause and effect. But of course, in both of those, we're not enlightened or fully enlightened. And therefore what? There's ignorance. There's things we don't know. This is the extreme importance of the Dharma, because there's something there to rely on, or at least test. I mean, again, it's not blind faith. It's not just grabbing onto it. Doesn't work that way. But there is something there shown up like an experiment. You can try this and see. So the hard thing is, it's like Nagarjuna said, that people come to the absolute through the relative. The relative is the harder one to accept. There's so many people in America, attracted to Buddhism and the profound concepts in that. It's all completely wonderful. But when it comes down to the nitty gritty, actually doing it, then the difficulties start. Why do I have to do a prostration? Well, you don't have to do a prostration. But why is there a resistance to doing a prostration? Because we don't understand what that prostration is doing. But the good thing about this kind of resistance is that if we have the good fortune of somehow having a stable faith, then like anything else, you get through the difficulties because there's something grounding you there. This is so important. This is especially the great function of, the lamas. You can have an experience. I just mean simple, simple faith. Not nearly articulated, nothing, but somehow you see it looks like a good person, looks like doing good things. You see some sort of qualities. You want those kind of qualities in yourself because you can see that's a better life for you than what is happening now, certainly better than when you look around the world. But this is a great anchor, this kind of thing. It's not an attachment to a teacher, important to understand. It's not some sort of, deification or blind faith, nothing like that at all, but something, somehow through that interaction, something has sparked in you, something that's in you kind of burned a little bit brighter and enough so that you recognize and can rely on it. Therefore, it's good. I mean, it's like someone going to graduate school or something. You go to a Harvard Business School. You don't necessarily know anything about these higher kind of concepts or, all the kind of knowledge they have. But you have a faith in that institution. You have a faith in the teachers there. They might be different. Some might be good. Some might be bad. But, they've all been checked out by somebody. So there's some level of qualification. And they're all within this greater, umbrella of learning a particular discipline. And there's a lineage there. It came from somewhere. It wasn't just made up by some huckster 2 days ago. All those things are extremely important for us. So the cause of suffering. In Tibetan, there are 3 synonyms for the primary mind, meaning the initial recognition of the nature of any object. And this is what's often, completely covered up because it's so fast. There are primary mind, stream of consciousness, and mind. The secondary mind, sem, includes all the reactions that follow the initial perception. So think of that, sem, the secondary mind, all the reactions that follow our initial perception. Again, the 3, primary mind, the stream of consciousness, namche, and the mind. Secondary mind, sem, includes all the reactions that follow the initial perception. The mind is in its entirety is of 2 kinds. The first is understanding, free of illusion, and that additionally has 2 aspects. the first aspect of the understanding free of illusion, the first aspect is direct understanding of the nature of an object. And the second aspect of understanding free of illusion is indirect understanding by means of reasoning, as when contemplating shunyata, or the law of cause and effect. All right. So, two kinds of minds. And the first kind he's talking about here, understanding free of illusion. And again, what's that? Well, it's both understanding the nature of an object directly or indirectly. The second kind of mind is incorrect understanding, or mind clouded by illusion. And this has 5 aspects. So what are these aspects of this mind that is clouded by illusion? The moments following the initial moment of perception of an object. All right? That's the mind that's clouded by illusion. We have this initial perception, and then immediately, just by time passing, it's already clouding. And you can see this, you hear a sound, and just a fraction of a moment later, I like it, I don't like it. Oh, this is, this music I've heard before. This sounds like a cat. Whatever it is, we're off on our secondary mind. So the second kind of mind, incorrect understanding, or the mind clouded by illusion. So first, the moments following the initial moment of perception of an object. Second is wrong views or understanding caused by the 3 poisons, especially by grasping to an independent fixed ego. This is like the yellowish visual perception of a person with jaundice. So wrong views or understanding, especially caused by clinging to an independent ego. The third is doubt or skepticism. That is the mind which floats between the 2 alternatives. So Guru Rinpoche said that the doubting mind is like a 2-headed needle. You're trying to stick it into a ball of yarn to get something good going, but because it's 2-headed, it just gets stuck all the time. Now, this is subtle, because at the same time, this doesn't mean that we try to throw away doubt. We can't throw away doubt that we have. We have doubt, but there are ways of dealing with it. This means to be attached to the doubt as having some sort of absolute truth to it, attached to the skepticism, which prevents the mind from going deeper. Nonetheless, fourth is uncertain belief concerning that which is true. So there we have a mind that's clouded by illusion. We have a belief, but we're just not certain about that. Of course, that's clouding things. We're not experiencing things nakedly. And finally, perception devoid of recognition or understanding. For example, while attentively listening to music, we may see visual objects later, having no conscious memory of them. I don't quite know what he means by that. Perception devoid of recognition or understanding. Well, I think what he's saying is like you're listening to music and you're just kind of distracted by visual thoughts that are prompted by it, for instance. All right, of these 5 that we just listed, the most harmful is wrong view. So let me read that again. The mind clouded by illusion, wrong view is the worst. Wrong views or understanding caused by the 3 poisons, especially by grasping to an independent fixed ego. This is the big one. It's really the big one. All this study and practice is to develop the view with a capital V. If you have the view, the right meditation comes out of that. And if you have that right meditation, the right action comes out of that. Because meditation is growing accustomed to the view. And then with that understanding, again, in this articulated way, action is perfect. That's why the Buddha is faultless. And it works the other way around. We can work on the actions, cause and effect, and meditating on that leads to the view. But it's so critical because you see this, you know, and with these teachings, the more that you become familiar with them and start analyzing your own life in this way, you see it in other people. You know, you see how people are just captivated by their view, limited by their view, mistaken by their view, and the trouble that they get in before because of it. Especially, I guess, me dealing with criminal courts and family courts, you know, you see it in a very exaggerated way. It's not so easy to see it in yourself, but you see this fundamental view that people have, and they don't know that they have it. And coming out of it, wrong view, wrong action. Wrong action, suffering. It's automatic. Okay. Let's see. Cause of suffering. Primary minds. There are 6 primary minds, one for each of the senses: visual consciousness, auditory consciousness, olfactory consciousness, gustatory consciousness, tactile consciousness, and mental consciousness. It is important to understand that the root of virtue and non-virtue is the mind, and that it is the power of the mind which motivates all acts. The power of the mind. The mind is thus the most important of the 6 senses, and the only one which does not rely on a physical organ. The primary mind, situated near the heart, understands directly, whereas the secondary mind, situated in the head, with its discriminating, differentiating power, understands through reasoning. So this is critical, actually, and comes up in the tantric teachings too, because you know when you think of the various deities that we visualize, like Tara is on this moon disk, right? Now the moon represents the quality of the light of the moon, like in tropical hot India, and beautiful, clear, cooling, not harsh in any way. So it's the practice of compassion, and the peaceful deities are seated on a moon disk, because it's this, like love, this the kind of truth we can accept, easily, because it's pleasant, it's pleasing. It represents the heart consciousness, where the directness, if you think about it, the directness of the senses. You hear a sound, it's immediately there. There's no thinking about it. It's just there, direct perception. Similarly with touch, similarly with taste. All of the 5 sensual consciousnesses is this moon disk. But the wrathful deities are sitting on, well, there's a moon disk, but on top of that is a sun disk. And why? Because it's brilliant. It's so bright that people can be almost afraid of it. And so it's related to anger, actually, the transmutation of anger. There's more power in that anger, but it's not the anger itself. It's the transformed power of it. But this is the 6th consciousness. This is the conceptual mind. And that's said to be in the brain, not the heart. So it's secondary, but actually in its nature, it's not secondary at all. It has the power of reason. And this is one reason that it's so powerful, because in our ordinary human state, here we have access to an extremely powerful kind of wisdom, which is reason, which convinces us, which we can rely on. And this is, exceptional compassion, because it's reaching us right where we are with our own dualistic mind. And yet we're using that, and we're actually using the essence of it. It appears as reason to our dualistic mind. All right. Does not rely on a physical organ. Amazing. All right, so secondary minds. There are 51. Those are the primary minds, those six. And this teaching comes up too in the mind-only school of Buddhism. Yoga Charya, it's called. They talk there about 8 levels. The 5 consciousness, then the 6th one, the thinking. And then the 8th one, let me jump to the 8th, it's called the alaya consciousness. So you already know this word, him alaya, him is snow. Alaya, storehouse, the storehouse of the snow. The Himalayas, that's where all the snow is. But the alaya consciousness is like our vast unconsciousness, in which all our karmic seeds are stored. They're all there, inactive. And so these 6 levels of consciousness, the 5 sensual and the conceptual, the thinking mind, and are linked to the 8th by this 7th level of consciousness, which is called manas. And it's like a conveyor belt. So when we experience things through our body, through our thoughts, whatever, it's like those impressions, you might say, or ripples or whatever, little seeds travel through this conveyor belt to the alaya consciousness and can awaken something there that's already stored there. So the cause is in the alaya consciousness. Cause is not seen, but it's there. It's like there's a bucket of gasoline there. The condition, the triggering condition, contributing condition is coming from our conscious awake life. And so we can do something like hatred, and the seed goes up, the contributing, and then it comes back down as this explosion of anger. We don't see this whole process, but this was kind of the scheme that the mind-only school of Buddhism, which, for most of the Tibetans is regarded to be the Buddha nature level of consciousness is very profound, but it's said to be, philosophically just a slight bit below the Mahayana, the Madhyamaka, the middle path. But we don't have to get into that right now. And nonetheless, so primary minds and then secondary minds. There are 51 secondary minds divided into 6 categories. All right. That which always accompanies any perception of the primary mind, again, the 6 primary minds, eye, ear, nose, tongue, body, mind, thus enabling the mind to make use of the object of perception. So secondary minds. Motivator and activator, which connects the primary mind to an object of perception. This is the most active of the 5 aspects of mind and is equivalent to karma. So the motivator and activator aspect of our secondary minds. And then the consciousness that enables the primary mind to distinguish between particular objects. And then third, the contact of mind and its object. 4th is mental and physical feeling of 3 kinds: pleasure, painful, indifferent. And then recognition of things and their various qualities, understanding the relationship between the qualities of an object and its functions. With this in mind, we're able to label the object of perception. So this is getting very much into the weeds here, but basically secondary minds, 51 secondary minds. The example, just to give you an idea of how beautiful it is, their teachings with this. So here they listed these, 5 aspects, 6 categories of the 51 secondary minds. This is amazing with these geshes. I mean, like Khenpos are like this too. They know all of these things. They've been memorized all these in their education. And so you'll see Khenpo sometimes. You ask him a question and he'll stop and you'll see him kind of mouthing things in Tibetan. He's remembering the verses that he had memorized. So let me just first go over the secondary minds themselves, because this is very long. Just list them, and then we'll touch next time on karma. So again, talking about 51 secondary minds to those 6 primary minds, right? That which always accompanies any perception, enabling the mind to make use of an object of perception. Okay. Second is the aspect of mind which understands things individually as opposed to simple discrimination. Then the mind of virtue. Then 6 primary kleshas: ignorance, desire and attachment, anger and hatred, pride, doubting that which is true, false views which arise from delusion. And then finally, the 22nd secondary kleshas. Oh boy. We'll read through these next time. And then finally, the remaining 4 secondary minds, just to give you an idea. The 6 primary kleshas, right? Which result in our continued wandering in samsara: ignorance, desire, anger, hatred, pride, doubting that which is true, and then false views. 5 major examples. False views are grasping to the self as being permanent, self-existent, the view that all phenomena inherently exist, belief that there is no karma, rebirth, or cause and effect, clinging to these above false views as being paramount and ultimate, and finally believing that samsaric practices such as asceticism or idol worship have ultimate meaning. All right, so we'll pick up there next time, because this is very dry stuff to go through. But I think it's just so valuable, because when you have this kind of, many people come to Dharma because they've somehow experienced suffering or have come to the understanding of suffering, that it is this tremendous issue, and that there really aren't any ways of around it or ignoring it or just hoping that it'll go away. Or like Kanze was saying, people think that, oh, it's really for the good. We just don't know. I mean, we come up with all sorts of philosophical little hiding places, you might say. Whereas, when you see, this the tanka of like Vajrayogini, she's naked. There's just no delusion at all. There's nothing standing between her and the view of truth. So this is maybe the toughest part of this book in the beginning, because interesting to me that he spends so much time, the traditional teachings do, on suffering and all these different mind states. And it's very helpful, because you get little glimmers here, there, and anotherwhere, and we all have our own sort of ideas going on. And sometimes you can come across something that's immediately challenging, which is good, because then you can dig into it. Or sometimes you have what you think is a negative thing, which isn't negative at all, like shame. It can actually be very positive. But we do have these teachings floating around in the culture that you're never supposed to be shameful of anything. Shameless. Anyway. Okay. So that's enough from me for tonight. Any questions or anything from anybody? Warren, our dedicated Warren. Yes. All right. Okay, then let's do a short dedication. May we use the experience and knowledge gained for the benefit of all. May we never stop until every last one is free, and in that way, freeing ourselves naturally without self-aggrandizement, everyone is a Buddha. Svaha. Okay, thank you all, and have a good night. Stay warm. Look out driving on the snow.